His iconic book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, had transformed the understanding of many people around the world because it, for the first time, really exposed the origination of our monetary system, how it came to be, and what the implications are for people like you and I that go to work every day. In his mid-80s, his mind is still as sharp as a tack. He kept me on my toes. You're going to find this interview very, very stimulating. So let me introduce to you my interview with G. Edward Griffin. Ed, I'm a big fan of your work, so I've been anticipating and looking forward to this conversation, so thanks for taking the time.
Well, it's a pleasure to hear that, Pat. Thank you very much.
So your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, I read several years ago, and I was mesmerized by it and also kind of shocked as far as its contents and what it revealed or exposed. So let me ask you this. What got you started to want to even write that book or approach that project?
You know, Patrick, it's like so many things in life. If you knew where you were headed, you probably wouldn't take that path.
Right.
I thought I was going someplace else. And I really didn't have an interest in the Federal Reserve. Back in the day when I was very young and I was trying to make a difference in the world, the one thing I had had a little experience with as a very young person was media. Mm-hmm. I worked in a television station. I was an assistant director, floor manager, and all that stuff. And I took speech and communications at the university, and I had a radio program and all that. So I thought, this is what I do. So I will put the communication skills that I had learned to work and tell people what I was learning. Mm-hmm. Well, that came a little bit later. You see, first when I came out of school, I thought I was going to be a big splash in Hollywood.
Right.
That's why the world was obviously waiting for me. And so when I got there, it was a really rude awakening. I discovered that there were a lot of people there with much better talent than mine. Right. And they were waiting tables and washing cars, waiting for their big chance. Right. But this time I had married my childhood sweetheart, my college sweetheart. She was the prettiest nurse on campus. We had a child, and we were, on the road. And all of a sudden, I was running out of money. Yeah. And nobody cared about me. It was a really rude awakening. So I went to work for a large corporation, and I was doing well. I was climbing the corporate ladder and all of that. So my life had shifted to now, okay, I'm in the real world now. Mm-hmm. Not this Hollywood stuff, but the real world. And it was in that stage, I was about 5 years with this corporation. I was, thinking about what I was going to be and how high I could climb the ladder, and I'm going to be a vice president, and I'm going to have all these nice material things and provide for my family and all of that, like most young people do. And then I began to read some stuff and hear some things about what was going on in the world that upset me. And I didn't know I had one, but my crusader gene kicked in. And all of a sudden, these things that I thought were important began to fade. Mm-hmm. And I began to think about, well, wait a minute, this beautiful country, which I was born into, which I thought would always be here because that's the way it is, right. I realized that it was had some problems, and that there were people who didn't want the way it was. They wanted to change it to something else. And the deeper I got into it, the more alarmed I became. And this is when the crusader gene kicked in, is I had to do something about it. And so, make a long story short, I quit my job.
Wow.
My poor wife almost. What are you doing? How are we going to live? So I thought, well, look, I know these skills. I'm going to start producing some little documentary films. Mm-hmm. And at that stage, I decided that I wanted to do something on inflation. Mm-hmm. I didn't know anything about it, except I thought there was a lot of nonsense about the cause of inflation. Mm-hmm. Nobody really seemed to know. They were pointing the finger at the other guy. And I thought, this can't be true. So I started to do some research and got some boxes full of papers and books and recordings. And I interviewed some people, some bankers and so forth. But then there was a group in Pasadena, typical little old ladies in tennis shoes in Pasadena that you may have heard about. Mm-hmm. And they had a study group on taxes. Mm. High taxes, okay. And they called me. They heard I was giving speeches, and free speeches at that. So they wanted to know if I would come and speak to their group about taxes. And I told the ladies there, I said, well, the one lady who was in charge of it, I said, well, I don't know much about taxes, but I might have something on a hidden tax. She said, well, what's that? I said, well, that's what I would talk about. Mm-hmm. Well, they went for that, of course. And so I came and I talked about the hidden tax called inflation. Mm. And of course, you don't do any research on that at all without getting quickly to the source, the engine of the inflation. Right. and the expansion of the money supply. And that's the Federal Reserve System. So that's where I was that's how I sort of eased into it. I had no intention of becoming any kind of an authority, except I had my box full of papers and research, and I could talk a little bit on it.
Right.
Well, the group was so impressed by it, and they said, "Oh, that was wonderful. You ought to take that on the road." You know? Well, the one thing you don't say to a budding young public speaker is take it on the road, because he will take it on the road. And so I did.
Yeah.
I started to put on some seminars called a Crash Course on Money. And they were well attended, and we were felt that we were doing some good, teaching people about the basics of money, inflation in particular, how to protect yourself against that, and so forth. And increasingly, though, people asked me at the end of these seminars, in the Q&A period in particular, they'd say, "Well, my husband died some years ago, and we have a small estate, and I don't know what to do with the money. Should I buy an apartment building? Should I buy gold or silver? Should I get out of debt or go into debt and get income, so forth?" And I discovered at that point that I was a fraud, because I didn't know anything about that. I knew about inflation and how the central bank worked and the Federal Reserve, but these were real-life questions about the market, and I knew nothing about it. So I stopped doing the seminars, and I enrolled in a school, a College for Financial Planning in Denver, Colorado, which was, I didn't want to become a financial planner. That was not it. But I thought, if I'm going to talk about this topic, I ought to know about the real world of markets.
Right.
So I went through that and got my designation. And then I was getting very serious about this topic because I was learning more as I went. The best way to learn about something is to try and explain it.
Right. I agree with that.
Because then you realize where your holes are. You have to go and fill in the holes. So by this time I had filled in so many holes, I felt I really should write a book on this. That point was the beginning of a 7-year project of research and writing.
Wow.
So I quit the process twice. It was the dark night, you know.
Yeah.
I said, this is too big. There's too much. I'm inadequate to do this. I'll never finish this. So I quit. But there was something in me, that crusader germ, that said, no, you can't quit. So I went back, and I finally finished it. So if I had known how long it would take and how much effort it was, and so many years with really jeopardizing our family, because when you're writing, you're not making any money, you know. So that's how I got into it, and I'm glad I did, of course. And it seems like all of the projects I've gotten into have been along similar paths. They zigzag around, and I've discovered, talking to people, that most of us have traveled those zigzag paths in our lives.
Yeah. So was there a certain point in time when you were in the research part of this book and you're writing it, that where it was like an aha moment, like, oh my God, there's something that seems, somewhat conspiratorial here? Or was it just incremental, like it just kept building on itself? Was there like that flash point where it's like suddenly, wow, this is not what I thought, and it's a story that needs to be told?
A little bit of both, Patrick. I think, first of all, it was basically incremental. But there were two little flash points that happened that I can think of right now. The first one was when I realized that the Federal Reserve System was created in secret, under conditions of extreme secrecy. There are very few wars in history that were launched under conditions of greater secrecy than the Fed. And I was aware that, you don't do things in secret unless you have something to hide. And that was the thing that caught me and kept bringing me back to that iconic meeting that took place on Jekyll Island, which was a private club island in Georgia, where all of these bankers went to get out of the public eye. And they spent a week creating the Federal Reserve System in this private place in Georgia on an island.
And what year was that?
That was 1910. Yeah, and so that idea of what were they trying to hide kept drawing me to it. I knew there was something important because it was more than just the history of how this thing came about. I began to realize that I was dealing with not the dull story of banking and discount rates and the history of who did this and so forth, but it was like a whodunit. And so that was my mission, is to show who did it and how they did it and where they buried the body and what it means to you and to me. So that was one aha moment. And the other aha moment came many, many moons later when I finally got near the end of the project, and I began to get very nervous about the idea of putting my work out into the world to be scrutinized by people who would disagree with me.
Right.
Many of whom, of course, were far more qualified than I.
Right.
They were, professors, they were teachers, they were academics, they were bankers, they were business people. And they had all of these credentials, and I thought, oh, they're going to chop me up in little pieces, I've made a lot of mistakes, I'm sure. But it was a certain point right at the end, and I began to get into debates with some of these academics. I thought they were going to tear me apart on radio and so forth.
Right.
And the second one came when I walked into a radio studio, and I've forgotten where it was. It was back on the East Coast. And I thought it was going to be an interview on my work. But instead, there was a guy sitting on the other side of the table, and he was introduced to me as Professor so-and-so from the local university, and that this was going to be a debate. Oh.
No time to prepare.
Yeah, this is where I'm going to be unmasked,
right.
as a fool.
Right.
So I thought, okay, here we go. So the first part of the program was, well, Mr. Griffin, would you tell us what you have found and what your theory is about all this? So I made my statement, and I think I had about 2 or 3 minutes to summarize it. And it was not very kind toward the banking system. And then, well, Professor so-and-so, what do you say to that? I was waiting on the edge of my seat. And there was a long pause. And he said, well, what you say is true, but we're living well, aren't we?
That's the response?
That was the response.
Oh, my goodness.
And that was the moment I knew I had hit the bullseye.
Right.
If the worst thing they could say is that, well, everything you say is true. It's okay. Yes, we're cheating people. Yes, we're financing wars. Yes, we're destroying the system. Yes, we're all these horrible things, but we're living well, aren't we? That was it.
That would be a pivotal moment.
Yeah, it was pivotal.
So let's review some of that then for people maybe who aren't familiar with the story. And I was curious too. Who documented that meeting in Jekyll Island? How were you able to find out who was there and what they talked about? Because it was a secretive meeting.
Well, Patrick, that was a lot easier than you might think because they documented it themselves.
Right.
Now, in the beginning, there was a lot of secrecy, as I said, and they didn't talk about it openly, but they were keeping their diaries, and their families knew about it. And later on, after the Federal Reserve was actually formed and was becoming an iconic, popular institution, wonderful American institution, then they began to speak openly about it. Say, yes, we really went there, and this is what we did. And they seemed to be competing with each other in a way as to who was the most important person in this. Yeah. In the beginning, though, they denied that there was any such meeting that took place.
Really?
Yeah. So it was, and then, of course, they started to write articles about it and give speeches about it.
Right.
And one of them wrote a book about it, and their historians recounted the story as told by the family and so forth. So there are a lot of very credible sources now, mostly original sources, that are in the public libraries if you want to dig for them. I found almost everything I needed in the public domain. I went to Jekyll Island and found some interesting tidbits in their archives. They make no bones about it. You can go to Jekyll Island now, go to the clubhouse, and there's the picture on the wall of all these guys. And on the door that goes into the room where they held this meeting, it says Federal Reserve Room.
Wow.
And there are their pictures, and it's sort of, hey, this is where the Federal Reserve was created, Wow. Well, of course, they don't go into the idea that they were trying to hide something. It's just that isn't it nice that these famous gentlemen were here and members of our club.
Right.
So
let's talk about what were they trying to hide, and what was the real intention behind the formation of the Federal Reserve, and how has it impacted our lives through those generations since?
Well, we're going to skip over a lot of old history about the evolution of banking and all of that. We come fast forward through all that vital information so you can really appreciate what's going on today, because this isn't the first time. Everything that's happening today has happened before in history. So what we find is that prior to the Federal Reserve System, there was, you might call it banking chaos in the United States and around the world for that matter, but we're talking about the U.S. Each of the states had created official state banks. And in the process of creating these banks, the states gave them permission to do things that were really unethical.
Right.
Under the promise that, well, we're going to regulate them to make sure that these unethical and these otherwise illegal things don't hurt anybody.
Right.
Because we, the trustworthy politicians, are going to be watching this, so don't worry about it. And what am I talking about? Basically, what they gave them was the power to create money out of nothing and to charge interest on nothing. And they gave them the power to imply, and in some cases openly state, that they were holding reserves of the depositors, holding them, and they called them demand deposits, which meant that you could come in and demand your money because it was there.
Right.
When in fact that was a lie, because they had taken that money and they had loaned it out, and it wasn't there at all. You could not demand it. The first 3% that got there could demand it, and they got it, and the rest were, we don't have any.
Right.
And they were allowed basically to lie about that. Now, that's not how the language came out. You know, you read it. It was written by lawyers, so it sounded pretty good. But in essence, there were things like that existing in all of the state banks. And so consequently, the banks were expanding the money supply based on loans and not cash deposits at all, which made them very precarious when there were runs on the bank.
Right.
And so the banks had to close their doors. People lost their savings because of this basically an unethical arrangement that existed. It would have been different if they had said, well, we're going to loan your money out so you can't demand it.
Right.
And maybe we'll lose your money too. But they didn't say that.
Right.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be secure there. That's
secure.
why you bring it to a bank.
That's the bank. It's secure. You know,
Right.
they didn't realize they were lending their money to speculators.
Right.
And not, I mean, bankers are speculators.
Right.
And so that was the situation. A lot of banks were failing, and so there was a national movement to reform banking in America. And so people wanted to have Congress, their elected representatives, step up as their defender and pass a law that would control these big bad bankers and prevent these runs on the bank and all, and loss of savings and all that. So the banks, the biggest banks, especially in New York, which dominated the whole scene, decided that rather than wait for a real genuine response from the public to reform the banking industry, that they themselves would get at the head of the parade.
Right.
And they would be the leaders of the cry for banking reform. And that's basically what happened, but they didn't want the public to know it. They wanted to control both sides of the debate. So the biggest bankers of them all were the ones that drafted the Federal Reserve Act, which was supposed to be to control the banks. So the banks themselves, the biggest violators, the biggest cause of all the public alarm, decided that they would draft the reform.
Right.
To reform themselves, of course.
The fox is guarding the hen house, basically.
Fox is going to build the hen house, install the security system, and guard it. Yeah. But they didn't dare let the public know that they were the ones creating it. That's why they had to go away from Washington, D.C., and they didn't allow any politicians. There was all the bankers. That went,
no politicians run
No
Jekyll
politicians.
Island. Okay.
There was an assistant secretary of the Treasury who was there. Why was he assistant secretary of the Treasury? He was a banker.
Right.
In real life, he was a banker. So they were all bankers, you see.
Yeah.
And they created this thing called the central bank or the Federal Reserve System in secret because if the public had known that the reform legislation was written by the bankers, they would never have gone for it. It's that simple.
So in essence, they're saying they're trying to self-govern rather than have the government govern them. They'd get together and do it themselves, but they're conflicted as far as how they would govern or what rules there would be. So what were some of the outcomes that have had these downstream adverse effects?
Well, first of all, your observation is correct. They wanted to self-govern, but that's kind of a gentle way of describing it.
Yeah.
There's a real name for that kind of an arrangement, and it's called a cartel.
Yeah, that's another one I've heard.
Yeah, and that's really what they formed.
Yeah.
The Federal Reserve System is a cartel of banks. In essence, it's no different than the oil cartel or the banana cartel or any other sugar cartel.
Right.
You get all the producers together, the big producers, and they decide to form an industry-wide association. They regulate themselves, and if they're really smart, which most of them are, they bring the politicians into it,
Yes.
and they take their cartel agreement and they pass it into law.
Right.
And they call it reform or to protect the people or give it some nice words.
That also can be known as collusion.
It's collusion. Yeah. In other words, they use government to enforce their own private cartel agreement.
Right.
And we see that happening all the time. And of course, the Federal Reserve is one of the most major examples of that. But we see it in healthcare. We see it in the utilities industry. We see it everywhere you look. These are cartels that bring the government into it and make it look like they're serving the people because government's involved, when in fact the governments are serving the private interests.
Right.
This is an important thing to understand.
Very important. Very important. So now it's formed. It comes into existence. And it's sort of interesting because it's not a government agency.
Not at all.
It's a private
Yes.
entity that is under government, I guess, would you say regulation or review? Or what is the accountability of the Federal Reserve to the government?
As I said a moment ago, they take their cartel agreement, they take it, in our case, to Congress. Congress stamps it, says we vote for it, now it's law. So now you and I have to abide by the rules of the cartel or we go to prison.
Right.
Because it's law. And because we go to prison, if we violate it, it makes us think that, well, it must be a government agency because only government can put you in prison, right?
Right.
Well, not unless the agency has been captured by the private sector, you see. Now it's not that way at all. It's upside down the other way. So that's really what's happening. It's not a government agency, but it appears to be a government agency because it has the power of government to enforce it. And that's what makes it hard for people to understand. It's got to be government, doesn't it? And it's not at all. It's a private banking cartel.
And who were some of the key people that were there at Jekyll Island?
Senator Nelson Aldrich, of course. He was the first one. He's the guy that owned the private railroad car, by the way, where all these guys got into a private railroad car in Hoboken, New Jersey, and they traveled for 2 nights and a day up down the coast to Georgia, and they got off and they went across the inland straits to Jekyll Island.
Now, he was a senator. Was he a sitting senator or a former senator?
Oh, he was a sitting senator.
Okay, so then there was a politician there, I guess.
He was a politician.
Okay.
Well, yeah, but he was a banker.
He was a banker also.
Well, he's a close business associate of J.P. Morgan and William Rockefeller. This was his financial base.
Right.
He was more of a businessman and a banker than he was a politician.
Right.
You see, but nevertheless, he was in charge of the Senate commission that was given the responsibility to come up with a proposal of banking reform. So he was just the perfect guy for it. He's a business partner with the biggest moguls in the world.
Right.
And so he selected the right people. He went to Europe and he went on a fact-finding mission and all that kind of stuff. But he knew exactly what he was looking for.
Were all the people there Americans or were there some Europeans at this meeting?
No,
also?
At this meeting they're all Americans.
Yeah, okay.
This is very much an American institution. Now you get into some shady stuff where we know that there was foreign money involved. We know that the Rothschild banking dynasty was very interested in and very probably financially involved in this, although it's hard to find out. You know, they don't publish those records.
Right, right.
But we know that the firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company was represented. And they represented the Rothschilds in England and France. And then there was the Warburg family in Germany and in France, I believe, and they were represented there. So we know there was financial interest from outside. But all of these people were associated with the Morgan Bank or the Rockefeller Bank. In fact, the Morgan Bank had 2 people there. And one was the investment trust and one was the banking industry. They were the biggest members of, the public called it the money trust. You know, it was fun because during those days we didn't have the internet when I was doing research.
Right.
So a lot of this stuff I had to get from the Los Angeles Library. And so where you find it there, these big boxes, they're microfilm readers. And you get these rolls of microfilm of 35 millimeters wide.
Right.
You bring them in and you turn the crank and the light comes down and you're looking at all these pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post going whizzing through you. It's like you're a god and you're looking at the history moving by. You know, zing, zing, zing. And every time I could spot an editorial comment coming along, it would be, break the grip of the money trust. Zing, back it up. Oh, yeah, there it is. The cry over and over again was, break the grip of the money trust. So the public and some of the politicians of the day were calling this the money trust. And this was what this legislation was supposed to break. And yet here were the members of the money trust being the ones writing the legislation. So who was there? All the representatives of the money trust. There was Abraham Piatt Andrew. He was the one who was apparently the Assistant Secretary of the State, of the Treasury rather. But he has an interesting story. He was one of the guys that went to Moscow on behalf of the banking interests literally with suitcases full of money.
Wow.
During the Bolshevik Revolution. And they were buying up the revolutionary movement.
Wow.
They actually were probably the major financiers of Lenin.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's one of the implications that's saying, that these bankers and the Federal Reserve, by proxy, are the profiteers of wars when they occur.
Of course.
Because these wars have to be funded, and where are they going for the funding?
Yes.
So is that one of the major implications?
Well, it's one of them. You bet it is, because this was a formula that was developed by the Rothschilds in Europe long ago. They found out that financing both sides of a war, both sides, was very, very profitable, because no matter which side won, you got your interest.
Right.
And it was outrageous interest, because when you're a ruler of a country, you don't care what it costs to win the war.
That's right.
Because you're going to get the money from the people eventually. Right. Interest rates are not important. It's get the money. Right. So you can hire the armies, build the factories, get the munitions, and so forth. So, war is very, very profitable.
And it's interesting because war is funded by private dollars then in that respect.
Yes.
And there are profiteers of wars when they occur. It's not just, the government's saying we're gearing up. The funding's coming again. It's funneled from that place. I don't think most people recognize that.
No, I didn't recognize it either till I got into that study. So there's so many layers to be exposed when you dig into the power of money.
Yeah.
It's when you think about it, money is at the heart of almost every transaction in human experience. And that doesn't make money bad. Money merely happens to be serve that function. Money can be used to serve good as well as evil,
right.
But it sure has been used to serve evil purposes.
So has the Federal Reserve, through its actions and the research that you've done, has it somehow turned us into like these indentured slaves or servants? Does it keep us in a predicament that causes us to constantly feed at that monster?
That's a very harsh way of putting it, but Patrick, I would say it's a very accurate way. I mean, when you clear away all the gentlemanly language to it, we become indentured servants to this system. Because I've seen various numbers over the years, and I don't know which is accurate, but here's what I'm driving at. People have attempted to find out how much of our lives do we spend earning money that goes to taxes and interest on loans. Now, just in your own mind, I don't know what that number is, but I'm sure it's over 50%.
Well over, for sure, yeah.
Half of our lives, and it could be well over that, because there are a lot of hidden taxes we don't know about. And interest on loans, when you think, you build a house and so forth, and let's just say the house is worth, just take a round figure, $100,000. And you subtract the value of the land and the value of the building materials, the nails and the wood and the shingles and so forth, and the labor, and you put all that up, it's going to be in the range of about $30,000, and all the rest is interest on money that didn't even exist when it was loaned.
And does this tie into inflation? And
that is the engine of inflation, of course.
So this is the engine of inflation, and as you're saying, so inflation is almost a tool used by the bankers to kind of perpetuate their scheme here.
Oh, it's definitely a tool. it's a great mechanism.
Can you
to
talk
extract.
about that a little bit?
Well, sure. First of all, what is inflation? It's just the expansion of the money supply at a rate greater than the expansion of goods and services that offset it. Now, if money was something that took human effort to produce, like gold or silver or anything else that people have to make with human effort, then the quantity of that money would expand or contract the same way any other good would expand or contract depending on the demand for it.
Right.
Because there would be the motive for people to produce it. They'd go out and dig the gold out of the ground and refine it. So it's hard to do.
Right.
So that is why whenever in history, when money was gold or silver, and there only been a few little narrow pieces in history where that's happened,
Right.
but in those periods of history, the purchasing power has remained constant, very constant over thousands of years. But when you break the money supply away from human effort and just say, well, let's vote on it.
Right.
How much money are we going to create now? Then, no surprise to anybody, the supply of money goes up and up, because especially when the banks create more money, that means they can lend more money. That means they can collect more interest on their loans, and that's how they make their profit, is on interest on loans. And so if you restrict the amount of money that a bank has to lend, you're restricting their income. That's why banks always say gold and silver is a terrible thing. We've got to have a flexible currency for you folks. It's for your own benefit.
And this is the so-called fiat currency,
The
where
fiat
it's not
currency,
tied to anything.
Not tied to anything.
Right.
It's just this formula that you decide. Let's make it 3-1. Oh, how about 4-1? No, 9-1. You know,
Right.
you vote on it.
Right.
So when the supply of money does increase, as it always does in a fiat system like that, at a rate faster than the supply of goods and services, then naturally the individual units of the dollars buy less and less of it.
Right.
And so that's inflation. It's not really hard to understand. And the only way to prevent inflation is to limit the money supply or gear it. And the only way you can really limit it is to gear it to something that takes human effort. If you say, well, we're just going to be disciplined and we're going to be really good guys and we won't increase the money supply, then it doesn't work.
I've never seen that discipline.
There aren't that many good. There aren't that many good guys out there when the temptation of huge money is.
But now, what this means to me as a worker in that system, and a producer and a taxpayer, is that if I work and I accumulate, some amount of money or wealth, and I'm holding on to it, saying, "Hey, I want to earn and compile." But now these people can just sort of, like you say, raise their hand, vote, an increased supply, and suddenly this money is devalued. So all this work, and I've already paid taxes, I've already done all the other things, the interest rates I've had to pay, and next thing you know, I'm sitting here saying, "Geez, I don't have much left. Who got this money? Where did the value get transferred to?
Yeah.
If I had this much money and it had this much value on a given date and time, but then the value of that money got transferred out of my possession and into somebody else's, and that's sort of the perplexing thing. And I think what you've identified is that got transferred, that wealth got transferred to these bankers.
Exactly. It didn't just disappear.
No,
it didn't go up to heaven.
Right.
It went to the banks,
Right.
to the bankers, and to the politicians, who were the first ones in line for the benefit of that, because they're the ones that get the first flood of money. It's usually called a loan or something like that. So they raise the national debt.
Right.
And like when they bail out the banks, that's an interesting subject. We may come back to that.
Yeah, well,
Here, the banks are really bailing out themselves, but they got to get Congress involved to approve it. Yeah. But anyway, so when they create these billions and billions of dollars, just like raising their hand, where does that go? It goes to the banks.
Right.
Or it goes to some corporation, worthy corporation. Why? Because they owe it to the banks.
Right.
That's why the only reason the corporations are getting these loans or these bailouts is so they can continue to pay interest on their loans to the banks.
Right.
If it weren't for that, nobody would care about corporations. Right. It's always, this is a system of the banks, for the banks, by the banks, and of the banks.
So the whole thing is rigged.
It is rigged, yeah.
Yeah.
That's why I said your statement a moment ago sounded a little bit rough, but it was pretty accurate.
Wow. Well, it's highly disturbing because obviously these are somewhat complex issues, and they're not really taught as a part of the regular education for the average American that's going through the educational system. Matter of fact, the educational system was designed to turn these people into factory workers to go to work every day to keep feeding this inflationary system that benefits these bankers, and then of course when all else fails, a good war will do, right?
It's an excellent fallback. Yes.
Yeah, and I feel like sometimes as I get deeper understanding understanding when I was, reading your book. It made me kind of sense that, like, I feel like a hamster on the treadmill, and I'll keep running faster and faster. I'm never getting off.
Well, that's the whole idea.
Yeah.
That's the whole idea. I published a little chart you may remember. I looked at these numbers and I thought, what did they mean over a lifespan? A little 3% inflation a year doesn't sound bad. 4%, 4.5%, 5%. Okay, we'll hold it at 5%. That doesn't hurt anything, does it? And yet, when you track that on a chart and you go 5% this year, 5% including the previous 5%, and project it out over the working span of the average person, over about 60 or 70 years, over the lifespan of an average person, these people have stolen 97% of everything you have saved.
Wow.
Over a lifetime.
Wow. And that's it. And you saved after taxes.
After taxes, yeah. If you put that in, they probably got it all.
Yeah. It's really somewhat incomprehensible, and in a sense, we're boiled frogs, right? We're born into it, so we don't really question it.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's just the way things are.
We don't question it. Exactly. That's what they want. That's why we don't have a monetary educational system that teaches all these things.
Right.
They teach the kids how to borrow responsibly. I saw an ad after the crash in 2008. All the banks were begging for money. All the banks were bankrupt. And the Bank of America, I think it was, put an ad on television. They had the audacity to offer a booklet to young people how to borrow responsibly. And they were the worst people in the world to be talking about that because they were bankrupt.
Yeah, that's a bit hypocritical, wouldn't you say?
That's like a whiskey company saying, drink responsibly.
And they try to do that in commercials
They do that. And we're not supposed to know this.
We want to sell as much of this as we can, but we want you to be responsible. It's pathetically humorous.
Yes.
Wow. So now the idea, though, is people say, well, we couldn't function without a Federal Reserve. So if you could wave a magic wand and make the Federal Reserve disappear tomorrow, what does the world look like?
Well, the world would look a lot better than it does now. Now, that doesn't mean there wouldn't be some problems because, unfortunately, we've just said that nobody understands money. They don't understand these basic issues, and so there would be chaos. Not because the system was changing for the better, but because people wouldn't know how to live under such a system.
Right.
That's the basic problem. It's up here. It's not in the wallet so much. So what it would look like is that banks would continue to do just about everything that they want to do, with one exception. They wouldn't be allowed to lie. They wouldn't be protected by the government.
Right.
They wouldn't be bailed out. They would be treated like any other business.
They'd be accountable.
To be accountable, yes. That's all that would be required. We don't have to get rid of banks. They serve a great function. If they didn't have this protection to be deceitful and to rob people. That's all.
Are there any practical measures people can take to sort of compensate for the predicament that we're all forced into with this Federal Reserve, as far as how what they can do with their money? How to maybe mitigate the appropriation of their money, of their hard-earned dollars that should be theirs.
To try and protect themselves a little bit from this chaos that we see around us. Well, yes, there is. I look at this in a sort of a two-phase view. There's the short term and the long term. In the short term, we can't think about changing very much because this is we need to turn the locomotive around and head back the other way. But right now it's going down the track with a lot of momentum.
Right.
And we know we got to slow it down and then maybe back it up. You can't just, bingo, stop it. So for a little while, we're stuck on this train moving in the wrong direction. So what do we do under those circumstances? Well, the first thing is to recognize that the national currencies of the world are fiat currencies. They're not backed by anything of intrinsic value. Therefore, they will inflate or they will deflate in their purchasing power and prices will inflate.
Right.
So since we know that, why on earth would we want to keep our savings and our wealth in national currencies or anything that represents national currencies? It's insane.
Right.
So the first logical, intelligent thing to do is take whatever wealth, little bit or a lot, we may have, anything over and above our daily activities with a little reserve for bumps along the road, and get it out of fiat currencies. That doesn't mean I'm giving any advice as to where to put them, because I'm not smart enough to know what's best for you or anybody else. But there are any place else would be better than having them in currencies that you know that every day, with every tick of the clock, it's losing its purchasing power.
Right.
So it's like standing on the train track and we see the headlight coming. Folks, first thing to do, get off the track.
Right.
Then we can talk about
That makes a lot of
some
sense.
of these other things.
Yeah.
But the question of what do you do with the money is not so easy, and that depends a lot on the individual. The only general rule of thumb is it should be something that has intrinsic value, that people want, and that will last a long time.
Right.
And of course, now you're getting into the evaluation of what is the good form of money, because anything can be used for money if it has intrinsic value and so forth. You might consider buying gold or silver. Of course, then you have to worry about who's going to guard your gold and silver.
Right.
So every investment opportunity you can think of has its challenges. There's
And
no
those markets
perfect-
can get manipulated too.
Everything gets messed up easily by the experts. And so I'm glad you brought that up, because no matter what you do, you better become an expert on it yourself.
That's right.
Don't depend on somebody to come in and tell you what they're selling.
Right.
Now, they may be perfectly reputable, honest people, but they're going to be biased in favor of what they know or what they have to sell.
Right.
It might be real estate. It might be a warehouse full of cheap white wine. I don't know. But I mean, everybody's got to figure that out for themselves. But get off the track, because fiat money is going down, down, down every day.
Yeah.
Now, that's the short-term view. The long-term view is more challenging, because I don't think there is any way that we can survive in the long term unless we change this system.
Right.
Eventually, this creature is going to grow and grow and grow and get a bigger portion of our lives and a bigger portion of it until finally they have it all. So if we're not willing to just sit back and say, well, let's live as best we can while in the time we have left,
Right.
a lot of people take that view. If you have that crusader gene that I have, and you have, and many people have, you can't just sit here and take this. You've got to do something. Well, that means we've got to change this system. We've got to become active. We've got to become responsible in the political field. We have to talk about it to our friends. We have to create a movement based on understanding, and this isn't easy.
No.
But we have to do it.
No, well, that's Revealed Films' statement of purpose is we make movies that make movements, and that's the whole point.
That's the whole point.
Is that kind of activism, I think, is required, and there has to be a reckoning at some point. I mean, it's funny when I talk to people and friends of mine, even that are economists, and I talk about the debt, and they're like, the debt's no big deal. I'm like, $20 trillion, well, look at all the wealth that we have, and the wealth's going to expand, and, servicing that debt is only this much money. I said, what happens if interest rates go up? Oh, that could be a problem.
So they're saying, everything you say is true, but we're doing well, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. That's that response. Look how well we're doing.
Look,
but it's not the point. My kids are born there. A portion of their life, a large portion, is already mortgaged before they're even brought into the world.
Yeah.
And so nobody looks at that as being a morally criminal thing, to do to a human being. So to me it's very disturbing. Now I have another friend of mine, wise person who's been around a long time, and he would say, as I was getting some projects, he said, sometimes you got to be careful whose rice bowls you're going to break. And in your case, you really called out very publicly a lot of very powerful people who have very large rice bowls, so to speak.
Yes.
What was the backlash for you after the release of this book?
Well, it wasn't nearly what I thought it would be. I thought that I would probably come under a lot of attack, and I overestimated my ability to reach a lot of people. I know how the opposition works now, and if I'd thought about it, I would have realized that what happened, which was not much, was according to formula. These people with the big rice bowls, as you say, they do have a formula. And you can spot it over and over again. And the first thing is that if they have opposition, they ignore it. And 9 times out of 10, that's all they have to do because it'll go away.
Right.
They have the money, the power, the media,
The influence.
and you have just an idea, or maybe a book or something like that. But if nobody reads the book, you're a flash in the pan. You don't have the resources to continue and pose a serious threat. So they just ignore it. It goes away. So that's the first thing that happened to me. They ignored me. I thought, well, isn't this interesting? I got kind of upset by that.
Yeah.
Come on. What?
You were hoping to get the attention, and they're smart enough not to give you the
They're
attention.
smart enough not to do that. Now, the next phase, of course, is on their part, is to demonize you. And I've begun to see a little bit of that happen because they will try and, as more people get this message, my message and yours too, they will demonize us. They'll say, well, those people are racists, or they're crackpots, or they're fascists, or they owe taxes, or they
Conspiracy theorists.
They molest little children. Or they have these conspiracy theories, ha, ha, ha,
Right.
things like that. And unfortunately, many of the people in the world will believe it because they read it in the newspaper.
That's right.
And that's usually pretty effective. That eliminates most of their opposition. I don't know what lies in store for me, but my crusader gene will not allow me to stop. All right? I know what lies ahead,
Right.
and foolishly, I'm trying as hard as I can to put me a little closer to the target. Because if we don't win this war, it won't make any difference. It won't make any difference.
Right.
We'll lose everything. So we have no option. We have to fight, and we have to win.
So, any final thoughts that you might have before we tie up, as far as what you think people need to know that we haven't spoken about?
Well, I don't know whether it's a final thought. It's just another thought. And that is that we talk about problems in the world. We talk about problems in the monetary system. Everywhere we look, we've got, oh, look at this. This is horrible. This is happening to us. We're living in a really wonderful time right now because in spite of all of those problems, we have the means of communication and research to discover what they are. And with the ability to get organized and build movements, as you say, we can create a movement to actually reverse this if we really want to do it. And the encouraging thing is we don't need a lot of people to do it.
No.
I, at one point, had the view that we had to reach 51%, right? The democratic view. We win the vote, and then we can do anything we want to.
Right.
And then I got a little smarter as I started to reread history. I recognized that history has always been determined by a minority, and an extreme minority, 3% or less.
Right.
It's certainly true in the American Revolution.
Yep.
Less than 3% were active in the revolution. Most of them were waiting to see who was going to win.
Right. Right.
And it's a hard thing to say, but it's true.
Yeah.
And even those that were in the revolution weren't quite sure what its orientation was. It was just a small group of people like Jefferson and Adams and Madison and Washington who set the pace. It was probably less than 20 people, 20 people in the continental area of the United States that were the leaders and motivators of the whole American Revolution.
Right.
So, and probably 1%, the farmers out there were fighting and willing to sacrifice, put their lives on the line, but they were following their leaders and so on. This is the way society really works. So all we have to do, Patrick, is reach that little 1% or less of the population who are willing to dedicate their lives to this thing and put the story out in a plausible way, in a reasonable way to explain it and to show the pros and the cons. And then larger numbers will follow along.
Yeah.
You know the old song, give me some men who are stout-hearted, and I'll soon give you 10,000 more.
Right.
That's how it works.
Right.
And so that's the encouraging part. We're living in a great period of history, and we have a wonderful opportunity with the tools of communication that we have to really make a difference in the world.
Well, I appreciate you lighting the torch here and helping to make a bigger dent in that 1%. And your work has been something that has made a difference in a lot of lives, in a lot of people's lives that you'll never know or never meet. But I'm happy that I'm one of the ones you didn't know that I've met you today. So thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Patrick. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you. Thank you.